He married twice. Both women lost their minds inside the same house, in the same bedroom, before the same mirrors. The town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania called it tragedy. The doctors called it melancholia. The newspapers, when they bothered to report it at all, called it a mystery no one could explain. But it wasn't a mystery. It was a method. And the only reason we know that today is because the second woman, unlike the first, refused to believe that what she was seeing wasn't real. This is the story of the Hartwell House, of two women who were told they were going mad, of a man who built his fortune not just on iron and railroad contracts, but on secrets. Secrets harvested from inside the very walls of his home. And of what happens when the truth, buried long enough and deep enough, finally refuses to stay buried. Stay with me, because this story does not go where you expect it to go. And if somewhere along the way this kind of history, the quiet kind, the hidden kind, the kind that took someone's whole life to uncover, if it means something to you, there's a link in the description of this channel. If your heart feels like buying me a cup of coffee, I would be genuinely grateful. It helps me keep finding stories like this one. Now, let us begin in 1821 with a man who arrived in a small Pennsylvania town with nothing but ambition and left a mark on it that took decades to fully understand. In October of 1829, Jeremiah Hartwell married Margaret Dunlap. She was 19 years old. The daughter of Judge William Dunlap, she came from one of the most respected families in the region, intelligent, warmly candid, possessed of an effortless social grace that made people gravitate toward her without quite knowing why. Where Hartwell was composed and calculating, Margaret was open. She laughed easily and with her whole face. She remembered people's names and the names of their children and their small concerns, and she had a way of making even the most formal gatherings feel like something warmer than obligation. The wedding itself was extraordinary. 300 guests at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, flowers imported from Philadelphia, music that carried past midnight, toasts that spoke of legacy and destiny. The Millbrook Gazette called it the social event of the decade, which was perhaps an overstatement, but not by much. In the weeks that followed, the match seemed as perfect as it had appeared at the altar. Margaret adapted to her new life with characteristic ease, managing the household, charming the staff, moving through rooms full of guests as though she had been born into exactly this life. Even those who had privately worried that Hartwell's ambition might overshadow her gentle nature found themselves reassured. If anything, she seemed to soften him, to draw out a warmth that few had seen before. For a while, everything was precisely as it should have been. But changes, when they are carefully engineered, rarely announce themselves. The first alteration was so slight that it barely registered as anything at all. Margaret would pause mid-conversation, her gaze drifting, not toward a window or another person, but slightly unfocused, as though she had caught the edge of a sound just at the threshold of hearing. When asked, she would smile and say it was nothing. Just the house settling, she would offer lightly. Old houses have their own language. It was a graceful explanation, and a house as large as Hartwell's provided no shortage of sounds. Creaking timber, wind against tall windows, the distant movement of staff through long corridors. But the pauses grew more frequent, longer. And then there were the mirrors. Margaret began spending long stretches of time before the tall glass panes of the master bedroom window, and then before the room's mirrors, standing close, tilting her head at slight angles, her lips moving in fragments too faint to catch. The staff noticed before anyone else did. They said nothing because there was nothing definitive to say, only a feeling, a collective unease that passed between them in glances rather than words. By early summer, the change had become impossible to explain away. Margaret began refusing to sleep anywhere but the master bedroom, dismissing perfectly comfortable alternatives with a certainty that bordered on urgency. "It doesn't feel right," she told her sister during a visit. "Not unless I'm there." She said it in the tone of someone stating a simple fact, which somehow made it more troubling than distress would have been. The dinner in August was the event that transformed private concern into something that could no longer be contained within the household. It was a warm evening, the kind where the air presses close and conversations seem to drift. Hartwell had invited several prominent businessmen from Pittsburgh. The meal began well. Wine poured freely, laughter rising and falling across the long table. Margaret moved through it with practiced grace. And then, in the middle of the third course, without warning or explanation, she set down her fork, stood, and walked slowly toward the large mirror mounted on the far wall. She stopped before it. For a moment she simply looked, and then she began to speak. Her voice was too low at first to make out the words, but it grew clearer. A conversation, unmistakably, with the reflection, questions and pauses and responses. Her tone moved from curious to amused to something sharper, as though she had reached a point of disagreement. The room had gone absolutely still. No one moved. Hartwell approached her gently and placed a hand on her arm, saying her name. She pulled away without looking at him. "I'm not finished," she said. The guests departed shortly afterward, leaving behind a silence in the house that felt permanent. That night the head housekeeper was woken by a sound, a soft, rhythmic tearing. She found Margaret in the center of the master bedroom, entirely undressed, stripping the wallpaper from the walls in long, methodical strips as though following a pattern invisible to anyone else. The floor was already covered. When the housekeeper spoke her name, Margaret turned and smiled with a serenity that was somehow more frightening than agitation would have been. "I need to see what's underneath," she said. There was nothing underneath, only plaster and wood and empty space. But Margaret appeared satisfied, as though she had found exactly what she'd been searching for. The physician was called. His diagnosis came quickly. Nervous exhaustion. Melancholia. Words that sounded clinical and controlled and explained nothing at all. Over the following 2 weeks, the progression was rapid and merciless. The mirrors became the center of her world. She moved between them continuously, speaking, listening, responding. When they were covered at the physician's instruction, she became frantic, clawing at the cloth until her fingers bled. She no longer recognized people consistently, not her family, not her husband. But the reflections, she insisted with quiet certainty, were real. "They understand," she said once very quietly. "They know what this house is." No one asked what she meant. Perhaps they didn't want to know. The final incident came on the 15th of September. Somehow, no one could explain how, Margaret gathered every reflective surface in the mansion, mirrors, polished silver, glass. She carried them to the master bedroom and arranged them with great care and evident intention into a pattern that made sense only to her. She remained there through the night, speaking and listening and waiting. By morning, whatever essential quality had made her Margaret was gone. She did not respond to her name. She did not acknowledge her husband. She spoke only to the reflections. On a gray October morning, she was placed into a closed carriage and taken away. She did not resist. She did not cry. As the door was latched shut, she turned toward the small reflection in the carriage window with a gentleness that broke something in everyone who witnessed it. "I'll be back soon," she said softly. No one answered. Margaret Hartwell would spend the rest of her life in the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, and she would never return to Beacon Hill. In 1833, a brief clinical notice arrived confirming her death. She was 23 years old. The house went quiet after that, but not in the way of a grieving household. Something heavier settled over it, a watchfulness, a sense of rooms holding their breath. The master bedroom was sealed. Its furnishings were covered in white sheets that gathered dust in slow, undisturbed layers. No one entered, and no one spoke of it. Hartwell withdrew from social life, though his business continued to flourish. Those who saw him in those years noted a change, a further sharpening, as though grief had stripped away whatever softness had remained. He became more precise in his speech, more deliberate in his movements. In the evenings, a light could regularly be seen beneath the door of his study, and inside, it was said, he had surrounded himself with books, medical journals, European treatises on the mind, works on nervous disorders and perceptual illness. He read with the focused obsessiveness of a man who believes the answer to something important is hidden somewhere in the text, if only he can find the right passage. He began keeping notes. At first they were observations, dates, behaviors, changes in speech and habit. Then something more organized, a reconstruction of Margaret's decline, assembled with the detached methodology of a man mapping a system rather than mourning a wife. He was looking for a pattern. Those closest to him, reading between the carefully controlled lines of his behavior, understood this. What they did not understand, what no one understood, not yet, was what he intended to do with it once he found one. 3 years after Margaret's death, he began speaking of marriage again, not in the language of loneliness or affection, but in the language of suitability, stability, compatibility, words borrowed from commerce rather than feeling. He made lists. He established criteria. He conducted what could only be described as evaluations. And it was through this process that he encountered Elena Rodriguez. Elena was the daughter of Don Carlos Rodriguez, a Spanish merchant who had recently established profitable trade connections in western Pennsylvania, and she was unlike Margaret in nearly every respect. Where Margaret had been soft-spoken, Elena was direct. Where Margaret had been content to listen, Elena analyzed and questioned and pushed back. She had been educated in ways unusual for women of her time and was sharply aware of it. Not arrogantly, but as someone who understood the value of a tool. She studied people when she met them, and she studied Hartwell with a particular attentiveness that he appeared to find, unusually, more interesting than unsettling. Their engagement was announced in the spring of 1834. The town received it with cautious approval. Some felt it was too soon. Others felt it was necessary. A man of Hartwell's position required a household, required an anchor. The wedding was elegant and restrained. There was no need for spectacle, only precision. The master bedroom was reopened and transformed entirely. New wallpaper, new furnishings, adjusted lighting, and mirrors. Many more than before, larger and clearer, positioned with evident intention. They caught the morning light and scattered it across the room in overlapping, multiplying reflections that were unmistakably beautiful. For the first 6 months, everything appeared ideal. Elena managed the household with quiet efficiency and a confidence that the staff found reassuring. She hosted gatherings that felt genuinely warm rather than performed. Hartwell appeared attentive. Visitors remarked on her intelligence and poise. There was nothing to suggest anything was wrong. The The first change came so quietly that Elena herself may not have noticed it. She began spending more time at her vanity. It seemed ordinary at first, a woman brushing her hair, preparing for the day. But the time stretched. Minutes became an hour, then longer. Her maid, Maria Santos, was the first to take careful note. Maria had come with Elena from her father's household, and she kept a diary, not for any grand purpose, but as a way of recording the texture of daily life. Gradually, those entries changed. February 1835. Signora Elena spends much time at the mirror now. This morning, nearly 2 hours. But she does not seem to be looking at herself. She looks beside herself, as though someone stands just out of view. Elena began to speak during these sessions, softly, conversationally, pauses in all the right places. One afternoon, Maria asked quietly if she was speaking to someone. Elena turned and smiled. Yes, she said simply. To her. There is no one there, Maria said. You're not looking in the right place. But what distinguished Elena's experience from Margaret's from the very beginning was its quality. She was not unsettled. She was not frightened. She was curious. Systematically, purposefully curious, as though she had stumbled upon something genuinely interesting and was determined to understand it. She described the presence in the mirror as a separate figure who resembled her but knew things she didn't. Historical things, things about the house, about conversations that had taken place before she arrived. Maria kept careful notes of what Elena told her. At first, she dismissed it, as anyone would. But then Elena began demonstrating knowledge that had no clear source. She described in precise detail a dinner that had taken place in the West Room 3 years before her arrival, the guests, the conversation, a specific glass that had broken and been quietly disposed of. When Maria mentioned this to Mrs. Quinn, the head housekeeper who had served under Hartwell for years, the older woman went still. She couldn't know that, Mrs. Quinn said. No, Maria agreed. She couldn't. But she did. And the specificity only increased. By late March, even Hartwell could not ignore it. He observed carefully, without alarm, which was itself alarming to those watching him watch her, because he did not look like a concerned husband. He looked like a man recognizing a pattern he had expected to see. Elena, meanwhile, had become increasingly direct. The medicine you give me, she said one evening, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. It's not what you tell me it is. Hartwell studied her. It helps calm your mind. It changes it, she replied. There's a difference. She paused. She showed me. Who showed you? She did. He exhaled slowly. You're not well, Elena. She looked at him with an expression of quiet patience. I've never thought more clearly in my life, she said. Which is exactly what should frighten you. It was shortly after this conversation that Don Carlos Rodriguez arrived unannounced. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had built his business on the discipline of clear observation, and when word reached him that his daughter was speaking to mirrors and making accusations against her husband, he did not immediately conclude she was ill. He concluded he needed to see for himself. What he found when he arrived was not what he had expected. Elena was composed, precise, and entirely coherent. She embraced him, studied his face, and said, I'm glad you're here. I need you to listen to something, and I need you to listen the way you listen when the numbers don't add up. He listened. She told him everything. The mirror, the conversations, the hidden passages, the medicine, the accusations, not in the fractured, desperate way of someone coming apart, but in the organized, sequential way of someone building a case. When she finished, the room was quiet. "How do you know these things?" he asked. "Ask me something I couldn't have learned since arriving," she said simply. He thought for a moment. The West study. The previous owner. Where did he keep private records? Elena turned to the mirror. A pause. Then she answered, "In a compartment behind the lower left shelf. There's a false backing near the corner." The silence in the room was absolute. Don Carlos looked at Hartwell. Hartwell's jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly, one of those small betrayals of the body that a man with perfect control can suppress everywhere except in the half-second before he catches himself. "Take me to the master bedroom," Don Carlos said. Elena led them to the wardrobe and pressed a sequence of points along the paneling that she could not have learned by looking. The panel gave way with a faint click, releasing a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to stand in sideways, stretching in both directions along the interior of the wall. Along its length, at regular intervals, small apertures opened into the rooms beyond. Not windows, not mistakes in construction. Observation points, deliberately placed, deliberately sized, large enough to see through, small enough to pass unnoticed. Mrs. Quinn, who had followed them into the room, pressed her hand over her mouth and said nothing. Maria went to the lantern. What the light revealed, set into shelves built directly into the cavity, was a collection of documents wrapped in cloth and preserved with the careful attention of someone who had expected them to remain undiscovered indefinitely. Don Carlos unwrapped them, one by one. Inside were ledgers, meticulously organized, spanning years, recording private conversations that had taken place within the house. Dates, participants, subjects, outcomes. Every entry structured, every significant word captured. March 15th, 1829. Discussion between Senator Patterson and associates. Northern Railroad route confirmed. Adjust investments accordingly. June 3rd, 1829. Judge Dunlap reveals financial vulnerability. Gambling debts significant. Potential leverage. Don Carlos read without speaking for a long time. Then he set the ledger down. "This isn't business intelligence," he said. "This is surveillance." He looked at Hartwell steadily. "This is how you built what you built. Not instinct, not intelligence. Access. Hidden access to things no one else could hear." Hartwell offered no response, because there was nothing left to say that the documents hadn't already said more clearly. But beneath the ledgers, wrapped more carefully than anything else, was something worse. A collection of letters, written in a precise European hand, signed by a Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of Philadelphia. Don Carlos read the first one slowly, then handed it to Dr. Henley, who had arrived by then and stood now at the doorway with the expression of a man confronting the magnitude of everything he had missed. The letters were not correspondence between colleagues. They were instructions. Detailed, methodical, refined instructions for the administration of specific compounds, mercury derivatives, laudanum mixtures, certain plant extracts, in controlled doses sufficient to produce what Zimmermann described as perceptual distortion without complete cognitive collapse. The goal was not illness in the ordinary sense. It was a specific kind of deterioration. The subject was to remain functional enough to be seen in company, credible in limited contexts, while developing fixations and behavioral patterns that would undermine her reliability as a witness to anything she might have seen or heard. The mirrors, the letters explained, were the most effective behavioral anchor. Subjects administered these compounds would develop intense reflective fixations, attributing their altered perceptions to what they saw in glass rather than to what was being done to them. This, Zimmerman noted approvingly, reinforced the appearance of hysteria while effectively concealing the external cause. The room was completely silent when Don Carlos finished reading. Elena's voice, when it came, was very quiet. "Margaret wasn't speaking to the mirror because she was mad," she said. "She was trying to make sense of what was happening to her. She was trying to find something steady to hold on to, and the only thing that didn't shift, that stayed consistent, was her own reflection." She paused. "I did the same thing. The difference was that I understood, eventually, that the distortion was being put into me, not coming from me." Henley lowered the letter. His face had changed in a way that had nothing to do with clinical composure. "I diagnosed her," he said very quietly. "I believed what I saw." "Yes," Elena said. There was no cruelty in the word, but no absolution either. "These compounds," he continued with the forced steadiness of a man who needs to say something useful, "would produce exactly what I observed. Hallucinations in reflective surfaces. Preserved intelligence operating behind distorted perception. She would have known on some level that something was wrong. She would have tried to say so." He stopped. "And she would have sounded precisely insane." "That," said Don Carlos, "was the design." Margaret's body was exhumed quietly in the weeks that followed, under conditions appropriate to the limits of 1835 medicine. The examination was careful and respectful. The findings were limited but unambiguous. Residual compounds in tissue consistent with the substances described in Zimmerman's letters. Mercury, specific plant derivatives, present in concentrations that had no legitimate medicinal explanation. She had not been ill. She had been made to seem ill systematically by someone who understood exactly how to do it and how to ensure that no one would believe her when she tried to explain what was happening. Every symptom had been engineered. Every behavior had been anticipated. The diagnosis that had ended her life in an asylum had been, in effect, written before she exhibited a single symptom. Jeremiah Hartwell was arrested without incident. He offered no resistance and no denial. There was something almost studied about his composure, as though he had always understood this might be the final act of the performance, and had decided long ago how he would play it. The investigation that followed expanded rapidly beyond the walls of the mansion. The ledgers contained names of men who had built decisions and fortunes on information they had no right to possess, men whose careers had been shaped by conversations they never knew were overheard. Some attempted to distance themselves when the scope of the records became known. Others denied involvement entirely. But the ledgers did not accommodate denial. They were too precise, too detailed, too consistently corroborated by events that could be independently verified. Dr. Zimmerman was located in Philadelphia and brought to face what he had done. His confession, when it came, was delivered in the flat, methodical tone of a man who had long ago separated his actions from any category of personal moral accounting. He described the compounds, the intended effects, the administration schedule. He stated, without apparent remorse, that the women had not been intended to die, only to be discredited. The distinction, he seemed to feel, was meaningful. The jury did not share his view of the distinction. The trial began in late 1835, and from the first day the courtroom was full in the way that courtrooms fill when the outcome matters to more people than just the parties involved. Because this was not ultimately about one man and one house. It was about a system, about the network of advantage and exploitation that the ledgers had exposed, and about the women whose suffering had made it possible for that system to operate undisturbed. Elena testified first. She was calm in a way that the room initially mistook for fragility, but which revealed itself over the course of 2 hours to be something much more durable. The composure of a person who has already decided that the truth is worth the cost of telling it. She described the progression of her experience not as victimhood but as investigation, the gradual recognition that the distortions she was experiencing had an external source, the moment the mirror stopped being a mystery and started being evidence. "I was not speaking to a ghost," she said. "I was speaking to the only stable point of reference available to me. And because I kept listening, because I didn't surrender to the explanation that I was simply becoming mad, I heard enough to understand what was actually happening." Maria's diary was entered into evidence, every entry read aloud. The early ones quiet and observational, the later ones increasingly specific, increasingly urgent, increasingly terrified on behalf of the woman she served. Mrs. Quinn testified about Margaret, about the progression she had witnessed and been unable to name, about the night she had found her stripping wallpaper from the walls, about the morning she had watched a closed carriage carry her away from the house where she had been systematically destroyed. Her voice did not break, but it carried the weight of years of regret in every measured sentence. Henley testified about the pharmacology, about the specific action of each compound, about the way they targeted perception without fully disabling cognition, about how a physician observing the resulting symptoms with no knowledge of their cause would reach exactly the conclusions he had reached. He did not excuse himself. He simply explained, with the precision that the moment demanded, how it had been possible for him to be wrong. The defense offered challenges. Forgery was suggested, misinterpretation proposed, alternative explanations for the passages constructed. But the evidence was interlocking in a way that made each alternative explanation more implausible than the last, and the consistency of the ledgers with independently verifiable historical events eliminated misinterpretation as a credible position. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts: murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud, extortion. The sentence was death. Hartwell received it without visible reaction. There was something in his stillness, in that final moment, that was impossible to read, whether it was acceptance, calculation, or something stranger. The system he had built had worked perfectly for years. It had failed, in the end, because of a woman who refused to believe that her own perceptions were the problem. Elena left the mansion within days of the verdict. She returned to her father's house, away from the hill and the mirrors and the walls that she now understood had been listening all along. The recovery was not swift or dramatic. There is no clean moment of return after an experience like hers. The compounds faded from her system gradually, over weeks. Some effects lingered longer. The sense of a second presence in every reflection did not disappear immediately. It diminished slowly, like a conversation winding down, until one morning she stood before a mirror and saw only herself, and felt, for the first time in months, that this was enough. She never spoke publicly about what had happened beyond what the trial required, not because she was ashamed, and not because she wished to forget, but because she understood something about the nature of exposure. That truth, once genuinely known, does not require constant repetition to remain true. It simply needs to be in the world. The mansion did not survive unchanged. It couldn't. The passages were sealed, the mirrors removed, the rooms reconfigured. What had been built as an instrument of control was dismantled piece by piece and rebuilt as something more ordinary. which is sometimes the most complete form of erasure. For years afterward, people in Millbrook avoided the hill with an instinctive unease they couldn't always articulate. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was recognition. The specific discomfort of knowing that a place you had trusted had always been watching. The case led to reforms, imperfect and incremental but real, stricter standards for medical commitments, greater scrutiny of private treatments, more rigorous documentation requirements. Not because the people in power suddenly became better, but because enough people had seen, in specific and documented detail, how easily a credible voice could be silenced if it was first made to sound unstable. Margaret Dunlap Hartwell was finally remembered correctly, not as a woman who lost her mind in a beautiful house on a hill, but as a woman who saw something she was not supposed to see, and tried, through every means available to her failing perception, to say so. She had been right about the house. She had been right about the reflections. She had been right about everything, in the fractured, desperate way of someone trying to describe a reality that was being actively dismantled around her. She was 23 years old when she died, and she spent the last years of her life in a place for people who could not be trusted with their own perceptions. The cruelest part of what was done to her was not the physical harm. It was that she knew, on some level through all of it, that she knew, and that no one believed her. The house on Beacon Hill still stands. In the records at the Allegheny County Historical Society, if you know where to look, you can still find the inventory of the passages, the dimensions of each hidden corridor, the precise location of each observation point, the rooms they overlooked. Someone mapped them, carefully and completely, as part of the investigation. The document was filed and shelved and has not been widely read. Some things get preserved not because someone wants them remembered, but because no one quite wants the responsibility of destroying them. And the question that the Hartwell case leaves behind, the one that doesn't resolve cleanly, no matter how thoroughly the verdict is delivered, is not about what was proven. It's about what was almost not. Because if Elena Rodriguez had been a different kind of woman, less certain, less willing to trust her own observations against the weight of a diagnosis, the story would have ended differently. Margaret's story would have remained a tragedy. The passages would have remained sealed. The ledgers would have remained hidden. And Jeremiah Hartwell, possessed of perfect patience and a very good memory, would have found a third wife. There is a version of this story, almost indistinguishable from the actual one, in which no one ever found out. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, not with fear, but with attention, because the systems that most effectively silence the truth are rarely the ones that operate through violence or obvious coercion. They're the ones that operate through credibility, through the careful, patient construction of a reality in which the people who see clearly are the ones who sound to everyone around them like they cannot be trusted. Margaret saw it first. Elena understood it. And between them, across years and silence and the long, cold patience of a man who believed he had designed something perfect, they told a truth that could not be buried twice. If you've listened this far, if these are the kinds of stories that hold you, the ones that take their time and uncover the past layer by layer, then this channel was built for you. There's a link in the description where you can support this work, buy a cup of coffee, and help keep these stories coming. Because stories like this don't simply appear. They're researched, they're reconstructed, They're found in records that were meant to stay lost. And sometimes, the most important thing about finding them is refusing to let them disappear again.